Wii U. When people look back at Nintendo's history, the Wii U stands out as one of the strangest missteps they've ever made. On paper, the concept wasn't terrible. Nintendo wanted to build on the massive success of the Wii by creating a more powerful console with a tablet-like controller, the gamepad. It had a touchscreen, motion controls, and the ability to play games off the TV, features that could have been game changers. But from day one, everything about the Wii U's marketing and branding was a disaster. The name itself confused the public. Many casual players thought the Wii U was just an accessory for the Wii, not an entirely new system. Nintendo's commercials didn't help either, often showing the gamepad without emphasizing the new console sitting under the TV. Parents walked into stores unsure if they were buying an upgrade or an add-on. Even retailers struggled to explain what the Wii U actually was. Combine that confusion with a weak launch lineup, poor third-party support, and a $349 price tag, and the Wii U quickly collapsed. In its lifetime, it sold just over 13 million units, making it Nintendo's worst-selling home console. Ironically, its greatest ideas would later fuel the Nintendo Switch's success. Sega Saturn. Few console launches in history are as infamous as the Sega Saturns. In 1995, Sega was desperate to beat Sony to the punch in the emerging 32-bit market. At E3 that year, Sega made a shocking announcement. Instead of launching in September as planned, the Saturn was already on sale that very day. The goal was to surprise Sony and get a head start. Instead, it turned into one of gaming's craziest mistakes. Retailers who weren't given advance notice were furious, with many refusing to stock the system at all. Worse, the surprise launch meant only a handful of games were available, making the $399 price tag even harder to swallow. Then, Sony delivered the knockout blow during their own E3 presentation. When it was their turn to reveal the PlayStation, the executive walked on stage and simply said, $299. That one number instantly undercut Sega by a full $100, drawing thunderous applause and dominating headlines. The Saturn's rushed launch and high price left it stumbling from the start. Developers were caught off guard, third-party support was thin, and sales lagged behind competitors. What was meant to be a bold power move became a legendary blunder that haunted Sega for the rest of the decade. Xbox One. When Microsoft unveiled the Xbox One in 2013, they managed to turn what should have been an exciting next-gen reveal into one of the craziest self-inflicted disasters in console history. Instead of focusing on games, the presentation centered on TV integration, sports partnerships, and a mandatory Kinect camera that drove the console's price up to $499. But the real outrage came from Microsoft's planned DRM policies. At launch, the Xbox One was going to require players to be online at least once every 24 hours, even for single-player games. Used games would be locked behind restrictions that tied discs to accounts, essentially killing the used game market. Gamers immediately revolted, and Sony saw an opening. At E3 that year, PlayStation dropped a mic drop video simply showing one employee handing a disc to another, captioned, "This is how you share games on PS4. It was a devastating blow. The backlash forced Microsoft into a humiliating reversal, but the damage was already done. Sony's PS4 surged ahead in sales while the Xbox One was mocked as a console that forgot about gamers. Although Microsoft eventually course-corrected, the botched reveal remains one of the wildest PR failures the industry has ever seen. Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 cemented Microsoft as a true powerhouse in gaming, but it also came with one of the craziest hardware failures the industry has ever seen, the infamous Red Ring of Death. Shortly after the console's 2005 launch, players began reporting catastrophic crashes where 3 red lights circled the power button. At first, Microsoft downplayed the issue, but as millions of systems failed, it became clear this was no minor defect. It was a disaster on a global scale. The problem came from overheating and poor internal design, which warped the motherboard over time. Some gamers tried bizarre home fixes, from wrapping the console in towels to using hair dryers to reseat the hardware, but nothing worked long term. As stories spread, the Red Ring became a meme, symbolizing Microsoft's rush to beat Sony and Nintendo to market. Facing mounting lawsuits and consumer backlash, Microsoft finally admitted the scale of the problem in 2007. The company extended Xbox 360 warranties to 3 years and set aside over $1 billion to cover repairs and replacements. Despite the setback, the 360 still went on to become a major success, but the Red Ring of Death remains one of the most expensive and infamous mistakes in console history. If you've enjoyed the video so far, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more videos daily. PS3 Classic Mini. When Sony announced the PlayStation Classic in 2018, fans expected a nostalgic rival to Nintendo's wildly successful NES and SNES Classic Editions. On paper, it should have been a guaranteed hit, a miniature PS1 packed with 20 classic games, preloaded and ready to plug into modern TVs. But what Sony actually delivered became one of the craziest console missteps of the decade. The problem started with the game lineup. While a few heavy hitters like Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid were included, many fan favorites were absent, replaced with puzzling choices like Jumping Flash and Battle Arena Toshinden. But the real disaster came with the versions of the games themselves. For nearly half the library, Sony shipped the inferior PAL 50Hz versions instead of the smoother NTSC 60Hz, even in North America, where 50Hz wasn't standard. This meant titles like Tekken 3 ran slower and less responsive than fans remembered. On top of that, the hardware emulation was lackluster, menus were bare bones, and the $99 price tag felt steep compared to Nintendo's offerings. Critics slammed it, fans abandoned it, and prices plummeted within months. What should have been a celebration of PlayStation's golden era instead became a cautionary tale about cutting corners on nostalgia. Atari 2600. No console mistake is more infamous than Atari's decision to rush out E.T. the Extraterrestrial for the 2600 in 1982. At the time, Atari was riding high, and the movie was the biggest hit in the world. Hoping to cash in on the holiday season, Atari secured the rights and gave programmer Howard Scott Warsaw just 5 weeks to design, code, and deliver the entire game. What followed is remembered as one of the craziest blunders in gaming history. The result was nearly unplayable. Players wandered repetitive environments, constantly falling into pits with no clear sense of how to progress. Children who expected to relive the magic of the film instead got one of the most frustrating games ever made. Atari manufactured millions of cartridges, convinced it would be a guaranteed blockbuster, but sales collapsed almost instantly. Unsold copies piled up in warehouses, and furious retailers demanded refunds. The disaster didn't just hurt Atari's reputation, it symbolized the wider collapse of the video game industry in 1983. For decades, an urban legend claimed truckloads of unsold ET cartridges were buried in a New Mexico landfill. In 2014, excavators proved the story true, unearthing the physical remains of gaming's most legendary mistake. Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 is beloved today for classics like Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, but one of its biggest mistakes nearly crippled the console. Sticking with cartridges in the era of CDs, Nintendo argued that cartridges loaded faster and were harder to pirate, but the downsides were brutal. Each cartridge could only hold 64 megabytes of data, compared to the 650 megabytes that fit on a CD. That massive gap limited cinematic cutscenes, voice acting, and sprawling RPGs that were thriving on the PlayStation. The choice also came with steep costs. Cartridges were far more expensive to manufacture, sometimes costing third-party developers over $20 per unit. That financial burden scared off major publishers, most famously Square. After making Final Fantasy a Nintendo staple for a decade, Square jumped to Sony and never looked back, bringing Final Fantasy VII to PlayStation and helping define Sony as the RPG powerhouse of the late 90s. While Nintendo's own first-party titles pushed the hardware to its limits, the lack of third-party support left the N64's library thinner than the PlayStation's. The decision to cling to cartridges is remembered as one of the craziest mistakes in console history, a gamble that cost Nintendo industry dominance. PSP Go. By 2009, the PSP had already carved out a strong audience, so when Sony revealed the PSP Go, it seemed like a sleek step forward. Smaller, lighter, and with a slick sliding screen, the Go was meant to modernize handheld gaming, but instead of building on the PSP's strengths, Sony made one of the craziest design mistakes of the generation. They completely removed the UMD disk drive. That single decision instantly alienated the PSP's loyal fanbase. Millions of players had spent years building collections of UMD games, yet the PSP Go offered no way to transfer or play them. It was a digital-only system, but the PlayStation Store's library was limited and inconsistent, leaving huge gaps in available titles. To make matters worse, the PSP Go launched at $249, significantly more expensive than the standard PSP, despite having fewer features. Retailers weren't happy either. Without physical games to sell, many gave the handheld little shelf space, dooming its visibility. Sony tried to pitch the Go as a future of gaming, but consumers saw it as a downgrade wrapped in a premium price tag. Within just 2 years, the system was discontinued, selling fewer than 1 million units worldwide. The PSP Go remains a textbook example of how to sabotage your own successful brand. PS Vita. When Sony unveiled the PlayStation Vita in 2011, it looked like the handheld that could finally rival home consoles. It had dual analog sticks, a gorgeous OLED screen, and horsepower far beyond Nintendo's 3DS. It was a dream machine, but Sony made one of the craziest mistakes imaginable. They locked the entire system behind proprietary memory cards that were absurdly overpriced. Instead of using cheap, standard SD cards, the Vita required special Sony-branded cards that cost multiple times more. A 32GB Vita card can run as high as $100, while the same size SD card sold for under $30 at the time. Considering the Vita leaned heavily on digital downloads, these cards weren't optional, they were mandatory. For many players, the cost of buying storage nearly doubled the entry price of the console. This decision crushed momentum right out of the gate. Early adopters praised the hardware but balked at the hidden costs, and developers saw the weak adoption numbers as a red flag. Combined with Sony's uneven first-party support, the Vita never reached its potential. In the end, it sold about 15 million units worldwide, far behind Nintendo's handhelds. The Vita had everything going for it, except the launch crippled by one of gaming's most avoidable mistakes: Nokia Engage. If there's one console that became a punchline the moment it launched, it's the Nokia Engage. Released in 2003, it was Nokia's attempt to merge a handheld gaming system with a mobile phone, beating smartphones to the punch years before they became mainstream. It sounded revolutionary, but in practice, it became one of the craziest design disasters in gaming history. The Engage looked awkward from the start. Its tall, taco-shaped design forced players to hold it sideways against their face during calls, earning the infamous nickname side-talking. Swapping games was even worse. Instead of popping cartridges in and out, players had to open the back, remove the battery, and then insert a new game. It was an exhausting process for something handheld gaming was supposed to make convenient. Beyond the hardware blunders, the system launched at $299, competing directly with the far more capable Game Boy Advance SP. Its library was sparse, filled with downgraded ports of existing console games that failed to justify the price. Critics mocked it, players ignored it, and Nokia's bold experiment collapsed. Despite multiple redesigns, the Engage sold only a few million units before being abandoned. Today, it's remembered less as a console and more as a symbol of how not to design one. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what videos you'd like to see next.